Welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. My name is Joe Evinger. I coordinate this group's events with the help of our co-host and tech expert, Hillary Naylor. All of our members here have varied educational and work backgrounds, but we all share a common interest in science and new ideas. We currently have over 70 members in our group and another 100 on a guest list. We meet via Zoom the second Thursday of each month from 3 o'clock until about 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month, talks on a topic related to science and ideas. And we rely on our science group members, Ashby Village members, our invitees, presenters, and others for ideas about new speakers and ways to connect with them. Here's what's coming up in the coming months. And on February 8th, David Sloan, Ph.D., he was the executive director of process development for Nectar Therapeutics, and he's going to give us a talk on From DNA to Drugstore, a journey through pharmaceutical biomanufacturing. On March, our founder, Roger Newman, will talk on landscape and language and history. On April 11th, Diz Swift, Ph.D. in geology, will present a talk entitled Climate Change, Evidence and Possible Tipping Points. May 9th, I have temporarily reserved for an AI presenter. I'm still pursuing several leads. We're always looking for new speakers. If you know anyone, please recommend them to me along with their contact information. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. Others interested in Ashby Village and our presentations are always welcome. I have to give a commercial here. The Ashby Village is a 501c3, a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. I ask, please, Hillary, would you place a link onto the website if you decide to make a donation to Ashby Village. Special thanks to Sarah Evinger for her help in preparation for today. And Sarah's now going to present our guest speaker. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I am very happy to introduce Joan Straumanis, who has had a very interesting career as a high school teacher, a college professor. She's been dean at 3 colleges, Kenyon in Ohio, Rollins in Florida, Lehigh in Pennsylvania, and president of 2, Antioch in Ohio, Metropolitan College of New York in Manhattan. She has also served as a program director at 2 federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Education, FIPSE, the Fund for the Improvement of Postsecondary Education, yes, and the National Science Foundation, where she managed basic research on neuroscience and learning. She was a founder of women's studies as an academic discipline and pioneered legislation protecting sexual assault to counselors and victims. Throughout her career, she's been active in promoting curricular reform and the use of active and interactive pedagogies in natural science and health science education. She has served as a public member on boards accrediting education in pharmacy, dietetics, medicine, nursing, and health management. Joan holds degrees from Antioch College, bachelor's, a master's from the University of Colorado, and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Maryland. As an active member of Ashby Village, Joan serves as chair of the outreach team, recruiting new members and volunteers. Take it away, Joan.
Thank you for that. It sounds like a long list of things that I've done. What it means is that I'm really quite old, so I've had a lot of time to do many things. So that's not the way to start. Let me start by saying that today, I'm going to focus on moral arguments. And I want to distinguish moral arguments from other kinds of arguments. There are all kinds of arguments about abortion. There are political arguments that we're very familiar with. There are some places where you can get elected if you are for abortion, and other places where you can't get elected if you support abortion. So there are political arguments, there are prudential arguments. For example, if I have another baby, I have to have an abortion because if I have another baby, I won't have enough money to educate the ones I already have. That's a prudential argument. Or you can say, or an argument like, I have to have an abortion because otherwise my partner will leave me. Those are prudential arguments. None of those are moral arguments. There are, of course, theological arguments, and I'm not really going to touch very strongly on that. And I want to distinguish moral arguments from theological arguments, because moral arguments don't invoke any kind of authority, neither leaders nor books. So I'm going to concentrate on the moral arguments, and let's start with saying that all of the people who have, many of the people who have sincere arguments about abortion, many of them are moral arguments on both sides. And so we need to be respectful of the fact that many of the people who oppose abortion do so on moral grounds. And so they're not necessarily following a religion, though they might be, but they are likely to be invoking some sort of principles about human life and the value of human life. So let me begin by talking about the favorite topic of most people who argue about abortion, which is the status of the fetus. And many people think that once you've decided the status of the fetus, the argument is over. But I'm going to show you that that's not true. But nevertheless, let's talk about the status of the fetus. Is the fetus, what is the fetus? People who ask the question, when does life begin, which you've heard very often, I'm sure, are asking a nonsensical question. The reason I call it nonsensical is because, let's be honest, the fetus is alive at all times, from conception on. And what's more, the precursors of the fetus, the ova and the sperm, they're alive too. So when does life begin? Well, billions of years ago. And we are the inheritors of life from those earliest ancestors. And there's no question at all about whether the fetus is alive. It is alive, unless it isn't, in which case, of course, we have other problems with some of the laws in some states about abortion. Even unviable or dead fetuses in some places can't be aborted. But I'm assuming we are talking about a live fetus, and when does life begin is not a reasonable question, because everyone should agree that the fetus is alive through every stage. So what people really mean when they say, when does life begin, is when does personhood begin? When does a fetus become a person who deserves the rights of a person? Isn't that really what they mean when people say, when does life begin? When does a fetus become a person who has rights? And what I want to argue is that a fetus is a developing person. And the analogy is the child becoming an adult. So what is the moment when a child becomes an adult? The answer is that it's a decision. It's nothing that science can help us with. We know that a 3-year-old is not an adult. We know that a 30-year-old is an adult. But what is the moment in between when a child becomes an adult? And the answer is, we have to decide. It's not arbitrary. It's not the kind of decision that you can make by tossing dice, because the 3-year-old is not an adult and the 30-year-old is. But there's some point between. In some places, it's the age of 18. Sometimes it's 21. In some religions, it's 13 or 12. And in various cultures, the moment of becoming an adult has been chosen in different ways. Exactly the same argument applies to the status of the fetus. When does the fetus become a person deserving of rights? And it seems to me that if we take this view, then what it means is that the fetus is not a person on day one, the day of conception, and is certainly a person when born. Is there a moment in between when the fetus becomes a person? Now, some people say, and especially this is true of people who adhere to certain religions, that the fetus is a person from conception. And that's not an arbitrary view. It seems to me that there's some benefit in saying that, some moral argument that could be made for that. But let me say that those arguments are very recent, that most religions, and especially in the Catholic religion, did not consider a fetus a person from conception. That's a new idea. In the 19th century, most religions considered the fetus to become a person upon quickening. And quickening means that that's the moment when the mother can feel the fetus moving. There were some unfortunate differentiations that were made in the past. For example, in the church, in the Catholic Church, male fetuses became persons earlier than female fetuses. And we could look up the exact dates, but in any case, they don't talk that way anymore, I'm glad to say. But they do claim that the fetus is a person from conception. I'm going to take that argument seriously later in my talk, not very late. But I don't consider the fetus a person when it is a group of cells. And then when it's a zygote, it has some characteristics of a person, but I think that we would all agree that it's not like a person as much as a newborn baby is like a person. So what's happening here is that the fetus is becoming a person with rights from the time of conception, not before, despite the fact that there was a wonderful Monty Python movie. You remember The Meaning of Life? And in that, they had a song, Every Sperm is Sacred. Do you remember that song? I could almost hum it, but it was a mockery of the argument that, that cells can be sacred and persons. But in any case, I don't think anyone seriously argues that that sperms are persons. So, but I think you can follow me when I say that a fetus is a developing person. And what that means for the moral argument is that a late abortion is more morally problematic than an early abortion. And that view seems to have been taken by several states and several legislatures who say that the personhood moment starts at 6 weeks of gestation. Some say 15 weeks of gestation. Some say 20 weeks of gestation. But I want to emphasize that science is no help. This is a moral decision, not a scientific decision, because according to science, every moment the fetus is more developed than the moment before. And that's a continuous process all the way from conception to birth. So I hope that makes sense. What that really means is that how you regard the fetus in terms of personhood is a decision, and it is in some places a political decision, and it's certainly a moral decision. So let's assume that the fetus is a person at all stages, from conception. Does that end the argument? Is that the moment when we say, okay, then abortion is murder, period? Well, the crux of my argument, and this won't take very long, I think it's an easy argument to understand. A pregnancy is the use, let's assume the fetus is a person, from conception. A pregnancy is the use of one person using the body of another person. So the person who's carrying the pregnancy is having their body used by another person. So let's look at analogies in the law and morality. Suppose I have a cousin who needs a kidney. What right does that cousin, or even my own child, it doesn't matter how close the relationship, what is their right to my kidney? Well, according to moral law and according to legal precepts, they don't have a right to my kidney. I can give them my kidney, and I would be very, very good to do so, but I don't have to. And if I don't give them my kidney, I have a right to keep my own 2 kidneys, right? Now, suppose the issue is not a kidney, but a whole body, my whole body. Does someone else have the right to the use of my body? It seems to me, on the analogy of the fact that no religion and no moral system requires me to give parts of my body to other people, no matter how close they're related and no matter how worthy they are. I'm not required to share my body. I'm not required to even give them my blood, even if it doesn't harm me. Now, what would we say about a person who does give a kidney or blood or some other organ? We would say that they have gone above and beyond what's required. And there is a word for that. If you listen to a philosopher for more than a few minutes, you deserve to have a $50 word that you can take home with you. And maybe you already know this word, and the word is supererogation. Supererogation is to go above and beyond your duty, to do something good that's not required of you. And I'm going to maintain that every pregnancy brought to term is an act of supererogation. If a person decides that another person can use their body, remember, we're not talking about cells here. We're talking about full-fledged persons from the moment of birth, even if you claim that. Their right to use my body should be no greater than their right when they're definitely a full-fledged person, a grown-up who wants my kidney, but needs my permission to give it. And if I give my kidney, that's an act of supererogation. It's a supererogatory act. There's the other $50 word. Now, this is true even if it's a life-saving gift. So it isn't considered murder in our culture or in any culture if I fail to give someone my kidney. and they die. But if I fail to give somebody my whole body, or I require them to be removed from my body, then that's considered murder by some people. Now, you will argue that there's a difference between failing to give somebody something and therefore they die, and actually killing them. And I certainly agree that there's a difference. Nevertheless, is that difference enough to justify my having to offer my body and all of my physical systems, all of my biological systems to another person who in some cases is uninvited and unwanted? And there we get into issues of rape. And I think that you would agree that if somebody were to kidnap you and take your kidney against your will, that would be a crime. So we can debate whether there's a huge moral difference between removing what is essentially a satellite, another person who is a parasite on your body, and actually letting them die. I think that, in fact, we need to understand that, especially if a fetus is removed at an early stage, when I would claim they have less claim to be a person with rights, it's not appropriate to call that murder, just as we wouldn't call it murder if a full-fledged adult were to hook up to my body and demand all of my biological systems to support them. That's the crux of my argument. I expect there to be some discussion. I expect there to be some questioning, but it's a fairly simple argument, and it's related to the argument about bodily autonomy that we normally take for granted. But the one exception of bodily autonomy is pregnancy. So should that be the exception? I guess I would, personally, I think not. But I do want to be respectful of those people who worry about that. So, would you like to get into this discussion?
I'd like to raise some points.
Yes, please.
So I wanted to mention a book that I've been reading recently by a woman named Kat Bohannon, and it's called Eve: How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution, which is quite an interesting book on a lot of levels. But the one that relates to your discussion is that she goes into great detail as to how the female body is assaulted by the fetus. That the fetus is really, I mean, parasite doesn't even begin to say it. I mean, the one that I'm the most familiar with is the loss of bone, because the fetus needs calcium.
And teeth.
Yeah, for teeth and bones and so on. So the fetus actually mines the skeleton of the mother. And that's just one. She goes into a lot of detail about
nutrition as well. That is, the fetus robs the mother of nutrition. So the fetus may be more viable than the mother in a starvation situation.
Yeah, and of course, in some cultures, they even compound the issue by saying that if there's a question of saving the fetus or saving the mother, you should save the fetus because the mother, I don't know, some reason. But anyway, that was one point. So that's has to do with your super erogation point. The other point I wanted to mention, though, you mentioned that that nobody has the right to your body, or it's your body, and so you have say so. And the one area that I've been personally threatened with is the state wanting to conscript me and put me in the army and send me to Vietnam, which thankfully didn't happen. But it did happen to
the use of your body, for sure.
Right. So to me, this is a taking. This is they're taking something away from me. And so I don't know if that's getting into, I suppose, a legal question. Do they have the right to do that? But if they do have the right under some circumstances, it seems to me that every legal system has to confront the question of when does the state, because the state takes a lot of stuff away from us. We lose a lot of freedoms because of the laws, and supposedly we all agree to the laws, but that's obviously not always true. But I mean, isn't there some moral reason for the state to be able to take my body and use it for their own purposes?
That's a very interesting argument, and one could talk about slavery as well, because
Sure.
slavery is also a case where people's bodies are taken for purposes that are without their consent. And it seems to me that even in the case of conscription, there is a barrier that's your skin. So even the military can't say, well, this other soldier needs your kidney, so you have to give it. I'm just pointing out what our culture accepts without question and asking whether pregnancy is really so different. And that's really the crux of the argument. Now, if we had all decided that it would be an obligation for people to share their bodies, that would be a very different world than the one that we live in, and it might be a little harder to justify abortion in that world. But you're right that actually, from a prudential point of view, abortion is much, much safer than pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
So many, many more people die from complications of pregnancy and childbirth than die from abortion if abortion is legal.
Mm-hmm.
Roberta, did you have a question?
Yeah. I mean, you certainly raise a lot of food for thought there, so thank you. I got stuck in one place because I followed you up to a point, but it seems to me that there's, and I'm not sure I can articulate it well enough, but there's a difference between an autonomous grown-up who needs a kidney and has rationality and choice and some level of autonomy in terms of, well, you don't want to give me a kidney, but maybe there are 5 other people who I could ask or who could do that. And the difference being that you now have an issue where there's a helpless entity that has no choice, no rationality, no options, basically, about whether it lives or dies. That's in everyone else's hands. So that's one place I get stuck. And the other is, in terms of the analogy, is that my comfort level is, okay, it's a zygote or it's, noodly fertilized. And I think, well, fine, I don't want this thing in me. I don't want to go through a full-term pregnancy. But then if you have the fetus that is now 6 months old, 7 months old, 9 months old, and has capacity to feel, and who knows, maybe even have certain amount of brain function, then it feels more like murder to me. I mean, unless there are extenuating circumstances like it's deformed or has no heart or something. So I'm wondering, if there's, I feel like that's where the analogy may break down and I kind of get stuck. But otherwise, I'm kind of with you. Interesting way of thinking about things. So I just want to put that out there.
These are great points, Roberta. You certainly are underlining my point that the fetus is a developing person and that a late abortion is much more problematic morally than an early abortion. You agree with that? And I think you underlined that in your comment. But part of what you're saying about options and being a rational being,
with choice.
Sorry, with rights.
Choice.
With choice. Part of that gets into the language that I was kind of avoiding about the fetus being innocent, and that you're, by having an abortion, you are destroying innocent life. Now, first of all, I don't know what the mother is guilty of. So this becomes a theological argument about whether all of us are conceived in sin and are guilty and so on. But to talk about the fetus being innocent life is close to what you were saying about the fetus not having choices, the fetus not having rationality and so on, and therefore maybe deserving of more protection. Is that your point?
Well, I think I'm edging in that way. I mean, I get stuck at that point.
Well, it seems to me that the analogy still works, because if the claim on your body is by somebody who doesn't have choices, it doesn't change your choice. And if the claim on your body is somebody who is innocent and you are guilty, what would you be guilty of? Let me name it: sex. And a lot of the arguments against abortion are arguments against sex. And if you uncover those arguments, they are really saying that the mother has invited the fetus to use her body by having sex, and therefore has given up her right to disentangle herself from this other person. Yeah. And that is a very heavy burden on this argument. It requires a point of view by which having sex is somehow removing your rights in ways that other actions wouldn't.
But how do you get beyond that sort of late term abortion issue when you have a more fully developed entity or person?
Well, I'm not prescriptive about that. I'm not saying that you have the same rights to abort a late term fetus. It does depend upon the circumstances in the case where, for example, if continuing a pregnancy would threaten the life of the mother, it seems to me that the mother, as a more clearly full-fledged human being, a more clearly a person with rights, deserving of rights, would have a priority over a fetus. But we have other people waiting to get into the discussion.
Yeah, Kester was waiting. Yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 points that I'd like to discuss. One of them Roger touched on slightly, and that is the societal issue. That society, in trying to achieve a balance between totalitarianism and anarchy, does impose upon us many things. Now, you said, you pointed out that maybe the skin's the limit, and yet there are cases where frontal lobotomies have been done on mental patients, where society has decided that the mental patient and society will benefit more by intrusive uh, uh, use of their body or parts of their body. And so it's not quite clear where the line gets drawn uh, along that spectrum. The other point I would like to hear you discuss is you talk about when does life begin, and that was a very interesting point that you made of it beginning, billions of years ago. But I would also question, when does death begin, from a metaphysical point of view? That if you believe, for example, in a an overarching chaos, or not a being, but a chaos, a Tao, if you will, uh, that is timeless and infinite, and that we are mere manifestations within that chaos, then the question of life and death becomes a more quotidian one rather than a moral and metaphysical one. So anyway, I would appreciate your comments.
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that I'm not saying that if a society makes a decision like to lobotomize people or to incarcerate people or to draft people, that that those are arguments that I'm going to take sides on. I'm not. I'm just saying that the abortion argument requires analogy. It requires that we consider these other states and see whether abortion, where it fits in our general moral scheme. That's my point. It isn't that I'm proposing that we choose, for example, to let the government take our bodies for this or that, or to lobotomize us. I'm not choosing that. I'm just saying that if you think about the analogy, then you see that this isn't an isolated case. It's like other things in our society. And in most cases, it's like things that would not be permissible to ask somebody to complete a pregnancy. And as far as your points about the universal chaos, I'll leave that for another occasion when you can give a talk on that. There are other people who are waiting to speak. Hillary, are you calling on people?
Yeah, just unmute people as a nudge.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Can I talk?
Jody has had her hand up.
Okay.
Okay, hi. So Joan, I just wondered, continuing your analogy and your argument, we have a population problem today. We're no longer trying to perpetuate the species like we were when the world began. Let's say I bring my 3-day-old baby home from the hospital. It needs my body to feed it, or at least my work to feed it if I'm not breastfeeding. I decide that's a pain and I made a mistake here. So I just want to let my baby die.
Well, in our culture, that would be a crime. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Because remember the developing personhood argument. I don't think I want to say that either a late fetus or a newborn is not a person. But of course, we are very familiar with cultures where infanticide is an accepted form of birth control, And in many cases, for example, in India and China, in recent years, and people know it much less, but in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and places like that, selective abortion is common for gender selection, and infanticide is common for gender selection. So do you want to make that a crime or not? I'm not going to decide that. I'm just saying that we can choose, or the society can choose. The society can collectively choose when a human life becomes a person deserving of rights.
I very much appreciate your emphasis on the fetus, an embryo is a life, and it's a developing life. One issue I have with when I hear arguments pro and against abortion is the refusal of the pro-abortion, pro-choice people to say it's okay to kill this human being developing in my uterus. And it seems to me we have to get over that hesitancy.
I love what you're saying. It's right. We use the language of our politics. So the people who are against abortion would say you're killing a baby or you're killing a person. And the people who are in favor of abortion will say you're killing the products of conception, or you're removing the products of conception. You're right that we should be tough-minded about this, that it's alive and it's human. There's no doubt.
Yeah, thank you. I agree.
Sarah?
There I am. Joan, I have a little secondary category I would like to inject if you feel it fits into one of your moral, prudential, political, theological categories, and that is the very emotional category, which may not be as rational as some of these other categories, but it is certainly one that affects anyone, I think, who goes through this decision, and possibly their partner if we're really lucky. And the fact that you brought up the little piece of the fact that this is a result of sex. It takes two to tango of opposite sexes to make this happen. So somewhere in all this is, you know, who are the responsible parties, and where does the emotional fit in? It seems maybe not so much moral, but maybe more in the prudential.
Possibly, but I think that we have to look behind. We have to part the grasses and look behind the anti-abortion arguments for the anti-sex arguments and acknowledge them, so that a person who believes that every single time you enter into a sexual relationship that involves coitus, that you risk having a pregnancy, and that therefore you have signed on to keeping that pregnancy viable. And that depends on your attitude towards sex. If you think that sex is an ordinary, normal thing, as ordinary and normal as other drives like eating, drinking, and sleeping, then you would not see entering into sex as a kind of signing a contract almost to keep a pregnancy viable. But if you see sex as a huge decision, a moral decision, and one that should be taken only in certain circumstances, then you're more likely to think of that as an obligation that you've deliberately incurred, assuming that the sex was consensual.
Okay.
So I'm just laying out the issue.
Thank you.
This is Virginia. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm raising my hand. I wanted to pursue a little bit further the issue of whether something is a moral argument or whether it has to do with morality, which is a little different. When I was a child, I remember finding out that, and I wasn't raised in a religious household, but I remember hearing that in certain churches, it was believed that if a woman was pregnant and there was a complication of the pregnancy that risked the infant's life viability, that the mother's life was expendable and the child was taking precedence, no matter what anyone else thought, that this was a religious view. And I remember feeling a little shocked when I heard that, being female, and wondered how much of that thinking has to do with ignoring the personhood of the woman. That if we talk about the personhood of the fetus, which I agree with what you've said largely, but what about the woman's view? And I thought here, you know, they're ready to basically abandon a woman who may have other children, who has a spouse, who has a life, perhaps a career. All of these things are expendable for this unknown but real entity. So does this fall under moral arguments? That is, in my experience as a physician, my life I've seen many, many cases of very, very difficult decision-making under those kinds of circumstances. And unfortunately, in most places, there's a more enlightened discussion and excruciating discussion about what to do. It's fairly rare. People who are anti-abortion seem to think that it's common or easy. Second trimester abortions are frequently because women can't get access earlier or for lots of reasons can't speak up. So are these parts of moral arguments, or is this morality in a different sense? Can you speak to that?
Moral arguments, but I don't think that they're always good moral arguments. There are different weights of moral arguments, but I do want to point out that in cases like you're describing, if we would part the curtains or look through the grass and to the other side of the motivation, it has to do with that word innocence, that the fetus is innocent and therefore more deserving of the mother who is not innocent, who has obviously engaged in sex and is certainly a sinner, as we all are. And if that is what's behind it, rather than that the mother's not a person, let's give them some credit and say, okay, the mother's a person, but the fetus is more deserving because the fetus is more innocent. And I think that's a very dangerous point of view, because it raises questions of what should I say, comparative morality. Who is more moral, the innocent fetus or the sinful mother? And that's very dangerous. And that's why I would rather invoke this argument about developing personhood. And for quite a long time, the fetus is less a person than the mother. I wouldn't say the fetus is more innocent than the mother ever, but I would say the fetus is less a person than the mother because the fetus is only a developing person.
Well, that's interesting, and thinking of all women then as being morally inferior. I mean, I just haven't experienced the dreadful mother who wants to rid herself of a fetus under normal circumstances. It just isn't a common event, but that's not the way it's argued, I think.
That's right. But I think when you think of the church fathers and the church leaders, because they're not all Catholic, I think if you part the curtain, they are worried about sin and they're worried about sex. And that's why they choose the fetus over the woman.
Well, thank you.
That's my opinion, and I think that the argument leads there.
Okay, back to the queue, Kester.
Thank you, thank you. I keep feeling we should move to a philosophical plane. Everything that's being talked about is very pragmatic. Some axiology of raising questions of value and how values are determined. But I have another point, and I would like to kind of add as a sidebar that Ashby Village sponsors a Wednesday afternoon philosophy discussion group that I host. And I would hope anyone that's interested in a discussion like this one would consider coming to it. It's not on Zoom, but you can find it in the calendar. At any rate, my point that we had a 2-hour discussion last week on free will. And a lot of what you're saying is about a person being able to make a choice. And so philosophically, the question of free will comes into play about how much freedom do we really have to make choices? And is it different for different people? If you get someone, I don't know what the term is for sexual addict, but if you get someone that has psychological problems, then the question of free will definitely comes into it, of whether they are capable, or any of us capable, of making an independent decision at any point in our life. So again, I encourage anybody who wants to come on Wednesday afternoons, but now I'll just take a comment. Thank you.
Thank you for advertising that. It's certainly intriguing for me. But I do want to say that most of the arguments that we've been talking about are philosophical. But the question of free will applies not just to the decision about abortion, but it applies to the decision of having sex. And it also applies to the decision of continuing to stay alive ourselves. So it seems to me that once again, we kind of, what should I say, humanize or naturalize the question of abortion, that it's of a piece with other questions. It's not a completely different domain of moral thinking. And that's really my main message. And that if we accept other kinds of moral thinking about life and about our obligations to other human beings, that abortion should fit in with that and not be a separate case. So I think, was Roger next? Hillary, are you keeping track?
Okay, sorry, am I here now? Yeah, so I just wanted to relate a short event that happened in my life when I was in my 20s. I went to Brazil, and I did an anthropological study in a small village. And one of the things that happened while I was there was I heard a big commotion out in the street. And I went out and found that there was this procession going to the graveyard with a small coffin. And so a child had died, they were going to bury it. But what was odd about it was the people were all laughing and carrying on as if this was a wonderful event. And I thought, clearly they don't regret that. I mean, they must regret that this child died. But when I asked about it, they said, well, the reason is because the child was young when he died and had not had a chance to sin. In other words, his soul would go directly to heaven. He didn't have to go through purgatory and all that stuff. So I I found this very very odd behavior. But my point is that it's cultural behavior, and that the people who are doing this are doing it because that's the cultural thing to do. A child dies, you laugh about it. And so probably you could say that it has some function in helping them to deal with their grief, or, you know, some other kind of stuff like that. But what it brings up to me is that when does this child become a person? I mean, is this child have free will? It's clearly the child is, you know, just is innocent. Means to me that they don't have free will. So in some sense, they're not a full person yet. And there are a lot of, if you read the anthropology literature, there are a lot of examples of cultures where the child is not considered to be a person until 1 year or 5 years, or it's different. There's a lot of different thinking about that. And it has to do, I think, with the fact that there's a lot of child mortality. So the question is, did this child come to stay, or is this child one of the ones that's not going to stay? And in some sense, then they're not really a person. So I'm just saying that this is a culturally decided question of personhood. And so when we talk about the morality of it, it seems to me that it's a cultural question, that morality is, it isn't something that's floating around there and we have to figure out what it is. You just look at the culture, and the culture says, here's what we should do. Now, in the United States, of course, as a modern country for one thing, and as a multicultural country for another, this raises all kinds of issues. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have so many nitpicking political arguments, is that there isn't a clear morality that applies to everybody. And so I'm not sure if you're going to try to make a moral decision, how do you do that? Can you look at your cultural precedents? Can you look at the authorities that you believe in? Can you read opinion polls? Decide what kind of a culture you want to live in? There's just all kinds of stuff that's muddying the waters there. And I just want to put in, do you think that there is such a thing as a morality that's separate from a culture?
The answer is, I am not a cultural relativist.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're an anthropologist, and most anthropologists are cultural relativists.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that morality is established by each culture, and it's according to the culture. But if cultural relativism is a viable position to take, it means that we can't criticize from one culture to another. It means we can't say, for example, that this is a culture that, unfortunately, I'm using the word, I'm using a term of evaluation. Unfortunately, they abuse women. Unfortunately, they bind their feet, or unfortunately, they do clitoridectomies. It seems to me that I want the privilege of discussing what's good for humans, what's good for human development and human thriving. And some of these cultural practices are not. And I can criticize a culture from within another culture, as well as criticizing my own culture, when there are practices that interfere with human thriving. And I have to say that a culture who says that women and men, for example, have different moral status, and that women are lesser or not, less deserving, I'm going to criticize that, and I'm going to say that that culture has made a decision that I consider an error. So that's my answer. I'm not disrespectful of anthropologists like you, who have great respect for what's done by a culture. And I do understand that there are places where infanticide is the accepted mode of population control, of birth control, essentially. But just as often or more often, it's used for sex selection. And I don't approve of that. So I think that the question of whether cultures should be respected in their entirety for their moral positions is one that I would answer not necessarily.
And I guess you would apply that to your own cultural
Absolutely.
background, right?
Absolutely. So I would say that we have the right to use a moral, let's say a universal moral criterion about human suffering and human development and thriving for every culture, the one that we're in and ones that we're not in.
But do you have certain standards by which you choose your morality, this universal morality? I mean, but people are going to argue about that. They're going to say, well, you know, universal, it ought to be no abortion. I mean, that it's just, you're making a choice.
I'm not saying that everything is subject to a universal morality, but there are just a few things about the maintenance of human life and human development, human potential. So those are that's the narrow domain in which I choose to evaluate.
But what about somebody would say that they value the earth more than they value the species? I mean, it's clear that our species is threatening the survivability of the whole earth.
Yes, and that humans are vermin and they proliferate to the detriment of the planet. Yes, I've heard that argument, and there's some sense to that.
So you come down on the side of people, not earth.
I do, but maybe that's just a prejudice.
Thank you.
I have a question about something Roberta brought up. If you're looking for consistency, which is why I think you're looking at analogies, then the issue of innocence or the issue of helplessness should be possible to find an analogy. And I think that living in San Francisco, as I do, I can tell you that there are lots of people who believe that their pets have more moral, they have more moral obligation to their pets than to humans.
Other human beings.
Yes, than other human beings, right. I'm being a little sarcastic, but it is true that it's very widespread reaction, not just in San Francisco, that people get very, very upset about the loss of a pet, either as if it's the loss of a friend that's human, or even in some cases more extremely upset. And I think the analogy is worth looking at least, you know, of non-human life and the gradations of moral obligation in those situations, and making that comparison, try to be consistent.
I think it was it Sarah that was talking about the emotional issues? This is where the emotional issues come in, and there certainly are people who would prefer who would prioritize their own pet over their neighbor's child. And I think that this is human, and some people are like that. But I think that we philosophers can critique that. We have good arguments to critique that. We have ways of saying that, once again, we can talk about degrees of sentience. And it's certainly true that animals can suffer, and that suffering is a bad thing, and that we should try to minimize suffering, and that Animals suffer to different degrees, as far as we know. But I would put the life of a chimpanzee, for example, as having more priority than the life of a shrimp. That's just me. But it seems to me that the same kinds of careful thinking about what's the basis of their claim to our, care, depends upon the degree of sentience that they have.
So it doesn't depend upon their degree of innocence or their degree of helplessness or lack of choice, is what you seem to be saying.
I don't think so. I don't see that lack of choice or innocence are helpful concepts, especially innocence, because that implies the guilt on the part of the other. And I don't know what they're guilty of.
Well, you categorize these and lump them in with innocence, but just set that aside for a minute and talk about the helplessness side of it. Leave out the ranking and say the helplessness is what is making people have compassion for the fetus. Okay, maybe that's a very small subset of the people who have that argument, who use that argument, because there are so many institutional settings where the institutional line has to do with innocence. But just forget about innocence for a minute for the philosophical discussion and talk about helplessness.
And I think that arguing that those who are more helpless need more help is a moral argument. So I would call it a moral argument. And once again, it's a sliding scale.
But it's a really important one, because that's where I really get stuck. I mean, we talk about free will, and it seems to me that around the abortion issue, there's a real power imbalance between those of us who have power to choose an abortion or to go to a state where one can get one or choose not to. But again, I get back to the powerless fetus. And, at what point in the development of this creature does his or her fetus deserve also some protections around choice and what happens to it? And at what point does it become a moral issue?
Well, I certainly think that it's a reasonable debate and a reasonable thing to choose one point in gestation rather than another. So, for example, those people who would think that a late abortion is immoral, I understand that, and I respect that. Those people who say even a late abortion is not as immoral as killing a baby, or killing a baby is not as immoral as killing a full-fledged human being. But I don't think that I don't want to choose, but I have chosen. I mean, I'm not recommending a choice, but I have chosen. And I'm saying that for me, a late abortion is morally more problematic than an early abortion because of the fact that the fetus is developing into a person with rights. But whether they're helpless or not, how does that fit in? It seems to me that
powerless would be the word I'd use, not helpless, but powerless.
Powerless, okay. It's certainly true that we have more power than the fetus does. And exercising that power it's a question. And that's why I say we need to respect the people who take a different position, because they're taking a moral position.
But this is where the analogy of non-human animals that are even somewhat similar to humans, for example, because just because we're more powerful than our pets or more powerful than any dolphins or whatever, who knows if we are, but just because we are, does that give us a clear answer to the question of who has more rights? I don't think it does. I
No,
think
I'm not claiming that it does. I'm just claiming that we should be careful as we think about these things.
well,
And
okay, I'm saying I don't think it does automatically, but the being careful part creates the opportunity to evaluate any given situation, which I
That's
think
true.
is the
That's
main
And I
takeaway is that evaluating each situation is a much more morally productive act than just blanket statements.
Yes, it's more morally, it's more creditable, it's more respectable to think carefully and clearly. And so, for example, I give a lot of credit to sentience and the ability to think, the ability to plan, the ability to recognize reality and that sort of thing. And therefore, there are some animals seem to me more sentient than others. So as I said, I would give more rights to a dolphin than a shrimp.
And most relevant, you might give more rights to a fetus who is nearly a born person, who's about to be born, than the mother, or you might give more rights to the mother, even in that situation, depending on what's going on with the mother and the fetus.
Can I jump in here for a moment? I've got 3 or 4 people all waving their hands at me. So let me, I think for about 5 minutes, uh, uh, Deborah Wu, have you've been waving at me, Sarah's been waving at me, and Kester. But Deborah, I think I saw you wave your hand first. Would you like to jump in?
Unmute, Deborah.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear you
Okay.
now. You go
I'm
first and Sarah second.
okay. A moment ago, Joan, you were up until a moment ago when I guess Roger jumped in, and that's kind of where I started having questions, because I was once presented about humanity, what makes a person. There was a Japanese woman years ago named Fumiko Kimura who walked her 2 children, maybe 3 and 5, into the Santa Monica Ocean, and she was committing parent-child suicide. She was charged with double homicide because she had intended to kill them and she didn't like the fact that they rescued her. Okay, and so the issue I was having to deal with when I was asked was, how to evaluate that case. But I'm really interested in something you said about cultural relativism and your difficulty embracing it. And I can understand that. But I'm wondering, in a diverse society such as we are, do you have any, guidance? Or, there's so many different analogies one could make. For example, I looked at these cases where you talked about women, but there were some legal cases I reviewed where the 3 men, maybe 3 or 4, they were Asian males and they had committed some killing, and they all received extremely different sentences because of that. I won't go into that. Then there were a group of cases I looked at with women, and they were exceedingly different. As you can imagine, we're in a society that values the individual. So I guess I'd like your help in thinking about American society, cultural diversity, what we should be thinking about. I had to grab some answers from within the legal system of what might be possible to evaluate, what should happen to this woman. We tend to have a binary system, mens rea versus you're crazy, or, so You
Well-
don't need to address me. You can just answer the other questions, and that'll be fitting at the end.
It was my hope that this would be a discussion of abortion, not the whole of morality. But,
Okay,
but,
bracket it then. Please bracket it. I really
But
want
of
to
course-
have you stay focused.
but of course, all these things impinge on one another. And my answer to you is that there's some benefit to being in a democratic society where we debate things and we make decisions collectively at best. When things are functioning properly, that's how we make decisions. And we should be making decisions about all of these issues collectively. And that takes into account differences in ethnicity, differences in culture, and differences in background and assumptions. So, of course, I would not expect that two different countries would have the same laws or even two different states. So that's my answer, that these are democratic processes that work out what we leave to private morality and what we insist on making law.
Thank you.
And Sarah, I believe you're next in the queue.
Thank you, Deborah, because that really hit on an area that I was pondering with my comment, which is that I grew up with the book that was our college Bible, Our Bodies and Ourselves. And I think most of the women that I know through Ashby Village and in my community feel it's sort of a very personal issue that is between me and a physician. That said, it's been really interesting to hear these different kinds of arguments and comments today, where we are looking at states deciding for us. We are looking at our religions deciding for us, an issue that is extremely emotional, personal, and whatever, medical. So just putting that out there. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yes.
I think Kester's been waiting the longest now.
Yeah, I have, again, just one kind of point to ask about, and that is getting back to something Joel was talking about with his dog. The case could be made, or at least questioned, that from the point of view of the universe, the dogs are actually better than the humans. The humans are trying to control, the humans are trying, and they're making a heck of a mess of it. And so does that enter into the morality of abortion at all? That, you know, if there's some question about if AI came along, that it would say the best way to solve the problems of the earth is to get rid of all the humans. Heaven forbid, but there is the question in terms of morality is what is best for the universe?
Well, what is best for the universe is a very interesting question, because the universe is not sentient and the universe doesn't really care. Now, it's true that the universe is harmed by certain decisions that we make, but the universe doesn't care. The universe doesn't have a mind. The universe doesn't have a sentient being in the way that humans and animals do. And so I have a prejudice in favor of sentience. And
yeah, and the fact that, pardon me, I'm sorry, Joan. The fact that the universe doesn't have any sentience. I mean, it used to be thought that plants don't have any sentience, but they in fact do. It's been very well demonstrated. And so that is a anthropocentric view that can't be proved or disproved, whether the universe has a sentience.
Okay, well, we can certainly debate that, and that would be fun to debate, actually. But in any case, as I say, I labeled it a prejudice so that you wouldn't accuse me of being irrational. I'm simply prejudiced in favor of humans and human development and human thriving.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Roger.
Yeah, okay, so I just wanted to make one point. I'm aware of all those criticisms of cultural relativism, and I certainly am on board with a lot of that. But I just wanted to say that in terms of our society, I think that this discussion is a pure luxury. In other words, in a lot of times and places, people have not had the luxury of having a discussion like this. They were more boxed in by their culture. In many cases, people just act out their roles. So, you know, they have very little wiggle room. And for just for survival, they may have to have certain roles that they don't really like. There's many Native American societies, for example, where if somebody is old and there aren't enough resources, well, that person has to go. And sometimes they go willingly and sometimes they don't. And you could say, well, that's really horrible. Aren't they taking care of their old people? Well, who are you going to take care of? You have to make choices there. And so the society comes up with a morality that says this is proper. And so there's probably going to be myths and stories and lots of ways to try to support that choice. So all I'm saying is, as far as cultural relativism is that you need to realize that we're in a cultural moment, just like everybody else is. And so our morality isn't necessarily better than anybody else's morality. We think it's better, you know, we like our morality better, but I look at my own personal history and I came up with the real anthropocentric point of view, you know, that people, our goal was to reduce the suffering and to help people and stuff like that. And I've now moved on to much more of I would call a geocentric view, you know, that the world is in trouble and people are the cause. And so maybe we need to have fewer people. So in that case, if you take the position that that people are causing a lot of trouble, maybe we should have fewer of them. In which case, maybe abortion would be a good idea. So anyway, I just wanted to say that there is a relative function here. It's not like cultural relativism is 100%, but I do think that it has a role in our thinking.
I do think so too, and I do think we should be respectful of other cultures and their systems of belief, and understand why they have those systems of belief. And very often they're different from ours, but no worse and no better. But there are some that I consider worse. But if we part the curtains on this question about the survival of the planet and the doing things for the sake of the planet, if we look behind the curtain, it's really for humans. It's for the future of the humans, our descendants, that we want the planet to be healthy. So it isn't the planet that is deserving of our morality or our concern, but the future humans who will live in that planet. And that makes me want to keep the planet healthy. It's because of those later humans. At least that's an argument that I want to put on the table. It's not for the sake of the planet as a planet, but it's as the home of future humans that I want to keep it safe.
Well, thank you for making that connection there, because we don't have to disagree on that point.
I have been holding off my question to the end, perhaps because it's a little self-serving as a recruiter for the science and ideas group. But sometime in this year, I'm going to have an AI, artificial intelligence person, come talk. And I would like to hear your first observations on can philosophy ever accept artificial intelligence, no matter how sophisticated it is, as being truly sentient? And what rights would you ascribe to such a creature?
I would say that I'm expecting that there will be a time in the future when it will be very difficult to tell whether an artificial system is sentient.
Is that enough?
I think that the question then becomes whether that sentience is worthy of respect and support. And I guess that I don't want to decide that in advance, because after all, we are just ourselves. We are just machines. We are mechanisms. We are biological organisms that are organized in a certain way, and maybe that's not the only way to organize sentience. Maybe there are configurations of other kinds of elements, metals and plastics and things, that can be sentient as well. And so I think that it will become harder and harder to decide what is the moral status of those machines.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions here? Sarah?
You had a question in the chat about birth
Yes,
control.
I do. About birth control, because hello, we could prevent some abortions.
I would think that every person who worries about abortion would love birth control, and yet they don't.
It can be against one's religion or whatever, or one's partner or whatever, but you know, it's out on the table there as a
Just look behind the curtain. It's about sex.
yes, yes.
Maybe we can all agree that we're in favor of sex.
And birth control.
Not if you're a strict Catholic.
Oh.
Sorry about that. There too, I think that Catholics don't like birth control because they don't like sex. And it's interesting to me that not just priests and not just clergy, not just nuns, but also philosophers in the history of humanity have been people who were celibate and who didn't choose sex, who didn't have children. And it's very interesting to me that the philosophers who established the field of philosophy, who people like Kant and Hegel, and I don't know so much about Hegel, but people like Kant and Nietzsche and all the great philosophers of the past, since the ancient times, since the classical philosophers who didn't have that view, but most of them were against sex. And they didn't themselves participate in sex. So what have we inherited? Oh my goodness, we've inherited morality from people who may have been quite unusual people, people who thought that ordinary things like sex and reproduction were not worthy of their interest.
Any other?
Once did an exercise asking my fellow philosophers to name 5 philosophers who were married. Of course, there were very few women, but let's assume that the men were most of the population of philosophers. Could you name 5 that were married? Very, very few people can do that. Of course, Marx was married, and there were quite a few 20th century philosophers who were married, but between, let's say, the ancient Greeks who were married, some of them, and the end of the 19th century, I don't think you can name 5 philosophers who were married. They're against it. So let's all say, as you did, that we're in favor of sex and we're in favor of birth control and we're in favor of reproduction to a certain degree. Not too many.
Yeah, thank you very
Thank
much,
you
Joan.
so much, Joan.
It was a very interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for participating. It was a very big pleasure for me.